everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 10th of October, where we are moving forward from our fiction section or our short story section into our drama section. I suppose you could say that all of these works that we're reading over the course of this semester are pieces of fiction, but just go to any bookstore and you'll see that they have a separate section for drama and a separate section for poetry. So usually when we're talking about fiction, we are talking about short story or we are talking about novel. Obviously, we didn't have time to read a novel, but we did have the time to read Battle Royal, which was a chapter from a novel. And while we are moving forward with talking a little bit about drama, you are hopefully thinking about your first paper, which is going to be based on one of the short stories that we've read over the course of our first unit. As you know, I've provided you with a couple of topics, whether or not you wanted to talk about canon or whether or not you wanted to talk about contemporary relevance. Based on the discussion forum responses, it seems that contemporary relevance is quite popular. That said, of course, you aren't obligated to talk about what you were thinking about in your discussion forum. I just wanted you to begin the process of contemplating what to do a paper on. And as you know, you can always create your own topic. You just want to make sure that you're having the topic approved by me ahead of time and that it is based on one of the texts that we've read in the short story unit. So, as you know, we've talked about a lot of themes over the course of this semester that you could turn into a paper topic. We've talked about the questions at the ending of the pieces that we've read, and that oftentimes they provide clues or opportunities for paper topics. Sometimes you can use the actual discussion forum questions or some of even the responses from your peers or myself as possibilities for formulating topics. So I wanted to devote our next class entirely to that first writing assignment, which is approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but approximately is approximately. And I had reviewed some of the conventions for writing papers, and I'll have a few closing comments for next class. And today's discussion question for our discussion forum, which would be due on Thursday, the 12th, is do you have any questions about this upcoming paper number 1? And if so, what are those questions? And again, if it turns out that you don't have any questions, you can just say no questions. That'll satisfy the requirements for your attendance. But as you know, I have the first paper due on the 19th, which is a Thursday. And my hope is that you would submit in early papers, but the 19th puts us approximately midway through the semester, so I just wanted to make sure that around this time period you would be submitting in your first paper because you will want to have feedback sooner rather than later. Of course, you know, things are a little bit different because we are a condensed class. So that said, we don't necessarily have to follow these strict guidelines with midway through the semester, but do understand that the more time that goes by, the less time you have for paper number 2, which is going to be based on drama, which is the unit that we are talking about now. And I can combine a couple of the readings that I had assigned for drama in today's class. As you know, whenever I can find links, I will share those links with you. So I was able to find a link for the first drama that we will be reading, Oedipus the King. And that said, dramas are ultimately meant to be performed, not read. So as you can see, we've got multiple classes devoted to each of the dramas so that there's time for us to watch performance and also to discuss reading. So you want to begin your reading sooner rather than later because dramas are longer than short stories. And what would be ideal is that when we start talking about Oedipus the King as a drama, you would have read it in its entirety, even though we have multiple classes devoted to it, so that you're at home reading the next drama, and that happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. And then when we're talking about Midsummer Night's Dream over several classes, you're at home reading the next drama, and that's our last drama, and that happens to be Raisin in the Sun. And then when we are discussing Raisin in the Sun, by that point, we would probably also be discussing possibilities for paper number 2, so that you can begin thinking about how you would approach paper number 2. And I'm going to give the same options that I gave with paper number 1. So for paper number 2 in drama, you could discuss canon. You could identify a drama that either you feel does belong to the literary canon or should not belong to the literary canon, giving reasons why. Or you could talk about contemporary relevance, a drama that you think still has contemporary relevance today, or perhaps doesn't, and then the reasons why. And if you choose either one of these topics, keep in mind that the focus is ultimately on the text itself. So, especially if you're talking about contemporary relevance, I understand the temptation is to talk about our own society. But remember, this is a literature class, so you should be analyzing the literature, which means you should be using a mixture of quotation and paraphrase. Next class, I'll talk briefly about quotation and paraphrase as well. So you should be referencing the text first and foremost. And that goes the same with literary canon, or if you happen to choose your own paper topic. So for instance, talking about something like the significance of the title in A Rose for Emily. So ultimately what you would be doing is focusing on all of the possible interpretations of that title and how that would be applicable based on the evidence within the text. So you are in effect a kind of attorney looking for clues, pieces of evidence in order to be able to put forth your particular argument. And if we were to continue on with this comparison, I suppose I'm the judge who's supposed to remain neutral, and that I need to evaluate the evidence that you've provided so that ultimately I can make a judgment. So it's not based on my personal opinion, and it's not based on my bias. It's ultimately based on the position that you happen to put forward. And everybody has the option of rewriting that first paper for a higher grade. I see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise. The second paper would be due at the ending of the semester, so you probably wouldn't have time to rewrite it. However, as you know, my deadlines are rolling, so that if you could get in your second paper early enough, there might be the possibility of our negotiating a revision for the second paper, but it's not guaranteed. For the first paper it is. I'll return it to you with the letter grade and my comments, and you can do a revision based on my comments. But if you need to reach out to me for further direction, please feel free to do so. And I ask that you submit in the revision along with the original graded copy with my comments, and you get the higher of the 2 grades. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to submit that in, but the earlier the better for everyone involved, obviously. So as you are thinking about paper number 1, I am moving forward and talking about drama. And the textbook actually gives you quite a few readings about drama. Unfortunately, those readings are not available online as free links because of copyright protections. But I'm hopeful that at this point in the semester you would have gotten your text. Also remembering that there is a copy of the text on reserve in the GCC library. And a couple of points that I wanted to emphasize about reading drama, because again, dramas are ultimately meant to be performed. So if you are reading a drama, you want to pay particular attention to the stage directions. Those are the only clues you're going to get as to how the drama would be performed on stage. And you also want to pay particular attention to characters, particularly character names and who is speaking when. Again, this would happen much more naturally on stage because you would see different individuals obviously reading their lines. So the appearance of the person and ultimately their differences in voices would clue you in as to which character is referencing a particular piece of information. You don't have those clues when you are reading a drama. So you have to slow down and read the stage directions, which will be in italics and will be those pieces that you probably are tempted to skip. And you also want to slow down and read the character names so you're clear as to who is speaking. And you want to try to visualize those characters as much as possible so you can differentiate them one from the other. The text also talks about the experiences that probably most people have had with drama in popular forms. Chances are that most of us have seen most of our dramas through television or film, not necessarily live. There's a whole different experience with seeing something live. There's a certain magic and electricity to it, and an unpredictability because a live performance obviously hasn't been edited for perfection. It would be the same with seeing a musical concert, for instance. But again, I think most of our experiences are through television, and they actually give you an example from a television show that you might have heard of. It is called Seinfeld. It was quite popular in the 1990s. So the 1990s would be the time of pre-internet. So there were very few entertainment options. So Seinfeld was kind of like this cultural cornerstone that almost everyone shared in the 90s. And the point that I wanted to make about it is the difference between reading a drama and watching it performed live. Because you can see in the notes below under the second section about drama that I have a very brief video from a episode of Seinfeld that I encourage you to watch, and it is part of the script that is included in the textbook. And if you have never seen Seinfeld before, then obviously you're at a disadvantage because you don't have the backstory. And if you have seen Seinfeld before, obviously you are at an advantage because you have an understanding of who the characters are. In fact, if you've happened to see this particular episode, which is called The Pitch, you've got the greatest advantage of all. And it's the same when we're reading and watching dramas. If you've seen these dramas before that we are reading in class, you have an advantage. Or if you've read these dramas before, you have an advantage because you have backstory. That's not to say you can approach them without having any background information. Everybody has to start at some point. But the more frequently you read a particular drama and the more frequently you watch a performance of that specific drama, then the more likely it is that you are going to be able to find the literary elements within it. And while dramas, again, are meant to be performed for entertainment and profit, the dramas that we read in literature classes have as many literary elements as the short stories that we've talked about thus far. So they're well worth reading as well as watching perform, because when you're watching, you're obviously going to miss a lot. Shakespeare is the primary example, that his works stand as pieces of literature, that each word could have meaning. But ultimately, they were written for performance, which I suspect is one of the reasons why so many contemporary audiences don't really care for Shakespeare, because their experience with Shakespeare is through reading and not watching performance, which was not the original intent. Obviously, this is going to take some time on our part, watching performances as well as discussing dramas. So that's where the additional time is going to be coming in. But the example that they give you, and I just wanted to read a few lines. This is in Act 2. Dramas are oftentimes divided into different acts. So these are differences in location. And in this particular instance, we're told that it's Scene G. This is the interior of NBC's President's Office Day. In my edition of the text, it's on page 1110, where we're given the stage direction that the mood is jovial. Stu Schermack is there, along with Susan Ross and Jay Crespi and Russell Dalrymple, the head of the network. And then Stu says to Jerry, the bit I really liked was where the parakeet flew into the mirror. Now that's funny. And George said, the parakeet in the mirror, that's a good one, Stu. And Jerry said, yeah, it's one of my favorites. And Russell says, well, what about you, George? Have you written anything we might know? And George responds, well, probably. I wrote an off-Broadway show, La Cocina. Actually, it was an off-Broadway. It was a comedy about a Mexican chef. And they go on and on. But if you were to watch the little clip, which is only a few minutes long, you'll see how much more vivid and entertaining it is to see the actors actually play out that brief scene. So that was the example, perhaps, of formulaic writing. Usually what you find on things like television is something that follows a formula, and Seinfeld was a situation comedy, a sitcom, and it definitely followed a formula. There would be some conflict which would be resolved at the ending of the episode. That's not to say, though, that it couldn't have creative elements associated with it. And if you've ever watched the show, then you know that it actually is quite clever. It's supposed to be a show about nothing. And when you read that little piece of the Seinfeld episode that was included in our textbook, you'll see that it's very meta and that the characters are proposing a show about nothing, which is actually what the show Seinfeld is about. That's part of the humor. And yes, it's written for profit, because ultimately television shows are meant to sell product. I mean, that's the whole point of commercials. But that doesn't negate the possibility that television or film can have literary elements within them. In fact, when we get to Oedipus the King, which we will be doing shortly, I will really argue that a modern day retelling is an excellent television show by the name of Breaking Bad. And if you've ever seen Breaking Bad, you might understand some of the references I'm making about a man who experiences a fall because of outside forces, but his own flaw or flaws. I encourage you to watch it. It perhaps is one of the best dramas I've ever seen on television, and it really is a retelling of Oedipus the King. But that said, the primary purpose of Breaking Bad was to entertain and to generate profit. It just so happens to have literary elements embedded within it. And the dramas we are going to be reading and watching definitely are dramas that have literary elements embedded within it. So you can expect some conventions when you're reading a drama and watching a drama. Certainly it's going to be longer than a short story, and it'll probably talk about multiple episodes as opposed to a short story that would talk about one episode. Dramas are usually divided into acts. These are the main divisions of the play, and we use the term basically interchangeably, drama and play. And think about what play is, the idea of play acting and about having fun and entertainment. That's really what storytelling is about entertainment, and all pieces of fiction attempt to keep to that element of entertainment on some level or another. And then you've got scenes, and those can be divisions in acts for new locations or for new characters. And oftentimes you'll have a subplot, not just a main plot, but secondary plots that mirror in one way or another the main plot. This is something that you will see with Shakespeare, and in fact, it'll be quite predictable with Shakespeare that we will see 5 acts, and we can even predict the kind of action that will occur in those acts. But Shakespeare broke all the rules. Even though he was predictable, that didn't necessarily mean that he was formulaic, at least in the way that we've been talking about formula fiction. Fiction that really doesn't have any kind of literary merit outside of entertainment and profit. Again, stage directions, as I had indicated, are going to be of such importance. These are the instructions to the playwright, or these are the playwright's instructions, I should say, to the actors about how they should perform the role. So there's an additional layer here. Not only do we have the text written by the author, and as we determined with something like A Rose for Emily, the author can have one perspective and we could have another. But now we have the actor's interpretation, and usually that's directed by the director. So now we've got multiple layers of interpretation here, which is why each performance is different. And expect a kind of pyramid structure to storytelling and dramas, and I would suggest that that pyramid structure is pretty accurate to all dramas and all pieces of fiction, that you have a rise and fall of action. The pinnacle being the very tip of the pyramid. And this is something that we will revisit when we talk about Shakespeare. So one of the examples they give you of a drama is just a one-act drama. So dramas don't have to be multiple acts. And it's called Trifles. It's a great piece. And the title kind of gives it away. Trifles means things that are unimportant. And even though it's very short, in fact, it's so short that in the textbook you'll see how it was basically translated over into a short story. So you could see the similarities and differences in storytelling from a dramatic form to a short story form. But it happens to be the story of some police officers who are investigating a murder, and they happen to be accompanied by their wives. And it turns out that while the wives are alone, they are able to piece together all of the clues, these little trifles, these seemingly unimportant things, to come up with the murderer, something that their husbands couldn't do. And they even come up with a motive. It turns out that a woman who had been misused and abused by her husband ultimately kills her husband on their deserted farmhouse in retribution for his killing the one thing that she loved most in life, which was her pet bird. And then the wives in the story make the decision not to tell law enforcement what they've learned. And again, there's a moral dilemma that's embedded in there, and I'm oversimplifying. I didn't want to spend too much time on this particular drama, though it's a wonderful piece, I can tell you that. But the three dramas that I selected, Oedipus the King is the first drama because it's so important historically. Shakespeare, of course, is so important and just in terms of the genre of drama. That would be A Midsummer Night's Dream. I deliberately wanted to give a comedy to kind of lighten things up. And then our last drama, something more contemporary, A Raisin in the Sun, a drama that was not even included in the version of the textbook that was ordered for this class. That said, I thought it was worth still having that drama and offering a separate text, a paperback version of it. And again, luckily, thus far, I've been able to find links for all of these dramas. So if all goes well, I can provide you with the link with not just Oedipus, but also with Midsummer Night's Dream, and finally with A Raisin in the Sun. So, in terms of writing about drama, the textbook gives you some suggestions and some questions. And the good news is that many of those suggestions and questions are very similar to the suggestions and questions that we were considering with short story. So, just a few ideas. Did you enjoy the drama or the play? Why or why not? What's the significance of the title? What information do you get from the stage directions about the characters? How is the exposition or background information revealed? How is the setting important? Is it used symbolically? Is there foreshadowing or clues about what's going to come up next? What is the major conflict? What is the climax? Is the conflict resolved? So many of these questions are very similar sorts of questions you would have asked in the short story unit. Are there subplots? That would be different because dramas usually are longer, so they can have multiple subplots with them. And how do they connect to the main plot? And who is the protagonist? Who is the antagonist? How does the playwright reveal character? Because we don't have the benefit of being able to see inside a character's thoughts the way we do with, let's say, a short story where he thought something. So we need to find another way to be able to give that information to the audience, whether that be that the character states their thoughts out loud, or it becomes a part of dialogue, or it's done as a voiceover. There are lots of different options. Who are the minor characters and why are they there? What kind of language are these characters using, and is the language appropriate for their backgrounds? Does your response to the characters change over time? Are there words or images that are repeated? How does the playwright's language contribute to the tone or the feeling of the play? Are there any unfamiliar theatrical conventions that are used? And again, we have to think about when these plays were performed, and ultimately, something like Oedipus the King would not have the modern day conveniences that we have today, and that would hugely influence the storytelling, as we will talk about shortly. What is the theme? Is it directly stated or is it implied? Does the play challenge or reflect your own values? How would you produce the play on stage? So if you were a director or you were a producer, how would you have this performed? How might biographical information about the author assist you understanding the play? Or historical information about the time assist you in understanding? How do your own experiences and bias influence your interpretation? What pieces of evidence from the play are you focusing on? And note that there are multiple ways to interpret a play, so which one are you going to focus on and why? How does the play reflect the values of the society in which it was written? In fact, they even give you a sample paper in progress about that very play that I was referencing earlier, Trifles, to give you an idea how one could write a paper. Keep in mind that the textbook also has given you samples for short story as well, now that you are writing your own short story. Now, in terms of Sophocles, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background. He is the author of Oedipus the King, and he was a statesman, a general, and a dramatist that lived in 4000 BC in Athens, Greece. So he wrote quite a few plays. Luckily, a few are still intact, including the Oedipus trilogy. Oedipus is a 3-part story. We're reading the first part, Oedipus the King. It continues on with the story of Antigone, which happens to be the story of the daughter as an adult who is first introduced to us in the first play, Oedipus the King. Oedipus at Colonus is the third story, and this happens to be of Oedipus as an old man. When we meet Oedipus the King in the first play, he's a young man. And at the time, Sophocles was seen as being rather revolutionary in modernizing drama because he added a third actor on stage. Now, again, you have to think about the limitations of stage conventions at the time. There was no electricity. And the theaters were built into what were known as, I suppose the best way to describe it, these huge stone structures. And in fact, I have a video for you to watch in the notes below where you could see that. These Greek amphitheaters where they would have rising seats. It would be almost like a sports stadium today. And that means that you would be able to see very little on the stage itself, which is why there was a limit of 2 characters rather than having multiple characters, because it would be too difficult to differentiate different characters from one another. But he added a third. One of the things that the purpose of drama was supposed to do is serve as a religious festival. So the state supported drama as well as to entertain. Specifically, dramas were a religious festival to the god of wine and fertility, Dionysus. Keep in mind, this is a society of gods in the plural. And again, those rows of seats built into the hillside, you're huge. Over 14,000 people could sit in them. And one of the things they did to help visibility was to use wardrobe. The actors would wear these large padded pieces of wardrobe with platform shoes to give them additional height, and these large masks over their face so that you could differentiate one character from another. And we think that the mask had mouthpieces in it so that it could project volume. If you know anything about the Greek amphitheaters, they were marvels in acoustics, so they basically carried sound quite well. There was lots of repetition of dialogue and action in the event that you missed something because you didn't hear it, or perhaps you just weren't paying attention. All of these things, including something called a chorus. So you might be familiar with something like choruses in let's say musicals, where you've got multiple people who happen to be singing at the same time. Well, that's obviously going to project volume. So that was one of the purposes of the chorus at the time. They didn't sing in Greek drama, they chanted, but that provided a kind of musical score. And the chorus could serve as a kind of narrator commenting on action, but the chorus could also serve as the community experiencing the action as well. And the audience knew the plot before watching Oedipus the King. And we will talk about the plot before we watch Oedipus the King. So you didn't watch these performances for plot. You watched it for the actual performance itself. This is going to be very important when we watch a performance of Oedipus the King. Now, one of the things that these plays were supposed to do was to teach moral lessons, particularly lessons against hubris, which was known as excessive pride, that any individual who showed too much pride would experience downfall. So that's one of the embedded messages in the play. And that what we would feel is a sense of catharsis. And this means that we would experience what the character was experiencing, but in a safe way. It's one of the explanations that's oftentimes used as to why people enjoy things like horror film, which I myself do, or enjoy riding roller coasters, is that you can live vicariously the experience, but know that you're doing it in a safe way and return back to normalcy. Well, this sense of catharsis or this purging of emotion that you would experience through watching these plays. Um, Specifically, according to Aristotle, and that might be a name that's familiar to you, a very famous philosopher, but also one of the first literary critics, talked about how Oedipus the king was perhaps the greatest example of tragedy that had ever been written up until that point. In fact, I'm giving you a short section to read entitled On Tragic Character, which is Aristotle's thoughts about tragedy. Obviously, we're reading translations of both Aristotle and Oedipus the King. We're not reading them in the original Greek. And Aristotle had talked about that a tragedy should be complex. If it's going to be a great piece of literature, it has to be complex. It should be terrible. After all, tragedies are supposed to be negative. And it's supposed to be about piteous events. And in fact, he even mentions the play Oedipus the King. And that we have a main character who's known as a tragic hero. And this is a great man, somebody who is above and beyond the ordinary, somebody that we can admire and respect, and somebody who is far beyond ourselves, who experiences a downfall. And the downfall occurs because of some sort of character flaw or flaws, and usually hubris or arrogance is one of the flaws, though usually there are multiple flaws. There are also outside forces, things like fate, for instance, which is what we will see in Oedipus the King, things that are beyond our human control. And ultimately, what that means is that we feel pity and fear for this individual. We pity them because they were good people, above and beyond the ordinary, much better than ever we could be. And fear because if they could experience this downfall and make these errors, well, they're so much better than we are. Obviously, we can experience the same or even worse. So we need to be quite careful not to follow in their footsteps with the errors they made. But yet, there also is this quantifiable unknown. Some people call it fate. Some people call it luck. Some people call it destiny, where we can't necessarily control everything despite our actions. The tragic hero accepts responsibility by the ending of the play for the role they had in bringing about their downfall. If they do not accept some level of responsibility, they could not be seen as heroic. And the characters within a tragedy need to be necessary, and they need to be engaging in actions that would seem to be probable for their characters. So if you have a character, let's say, who's very inconsistent, then he should act inconsistently to be true to his character. And you might, if you are taking psychology, be familiar with Sigmund Freud, the great psychologist, considered the father of psychology. And he basically formalized psychology as an academic discipline. He basically took the play Oedipus the King and very loosely used the name Oedipus for one of his most famous theories, the Oedipal complex, which we will also be talking about in class when we talk about Oedipus the King. You will see that obviously Freud took great liberties. Freud's theory is that, according to Freud, all young boys have some sexual attraction to their mothers and see their fathers as competition and want to kill them. That's not exactly what happens in Oedipus the King. We'll talk about the plot in Oedipus the King in the next couple classes. But there's enough similarity there so you could see how Freud was inspired for his Oedipal complex. So all of the reasons why Oedipus the King is so important, whether it be Aristotle's determination that this was perhaps the greatest tragedy ever written, from a historical perspective, Oedipus the King really laid the foundations for the criteria for what we expect with tragedy. And of course, when we get to Shakespeare, he's probably best known for his tragedies. And also how individuals like Sigmund Freud were inspired enough by Oedipus the King to be able to label some of their psychological theories after the drama. So again, obviously this was originally written in Greek, and it was also written in poetry, which makes it quite complex, especially when we're reading a translation. Translations are always tricky because you can never get the true sense. I've always said that I've never really read Oedipus the King in its entirety. I've never really read Oedipus the King in its entirety. I've read many translations, but I've never read it in the Greek purely because I don't speak Greek. And my suspicion is that probably you don't either. So unless you're reading it in the Greek, you're not really getting a true sense of the drama. And then the fact that it was written in poetry. So poetry is all about the musicality of the language. And of course, that's determined on the actual language that you're speaking. It's something that we will see with Shakespeare, and luckily he was writing in English, so we can hear that musicality because we speak English. That's not to say that Shakespeare's English wasn't different than our English today. It certainly was. But there are enough similarities there so that we can read it in the original. That would not be the case in the Greek. So if you're a translator and you are translating Oedipus the King, you're trying to translate the plot into English or whatever language you're translating into as accurately as possible. But you're also trying to keep the musicality of the words. So usually what you're doing is trading off. A little bit of trade-off with the plot, a little bit of trade-off with the sound to end up with the actual story itself. So there are many different translations of Oedipus the King, but keep in mind again, the audience would have already known the plot of Oedipus the King, so we're already going to know the plot of Oedipus the King. So I'm less concerned with the actual specifics of the language themselves and more concerned with the overall themes and the actual performance that we're going to be watching. So, as I had indicated, if you look in the notes below, it's a site from MIT where you can access Oedipus the King, the play in its entirety. I'm going to talk a little bit about the plot of Oedipus the King now, in the event that it turns out that you do want to start reading Oedipus the King. And basically, this play begins in media res, which means in the middle. And Oedipus the King begins with Oedipus, who is a king, who is lamenting the fact that his community is being ravaged by plague. So people are dying and suffering. And he's a good man, above and beyond the ordinary. So basically what he wants to do is to try to solve the plague by determining how they've angered the gods. Again, keep in mind that this is a society of gods. They've come to the conclusion that they're being punished through plague for some sort of wrongdoing. So Oedipus sends out lots of messengers to go talk to oracles to try to figure out what sin the community has committed so that they can atone for their sins and end the plague. And the answer keeps coming back as the same, that it's Oedipus himself who's responsible for this plague, and he's horrified. He even sends out his own brother-in-law to get information, and Oedipus's brother-in-law Creon says, "You're responsible, Oedipus." And Oedipus is so angered by this that he accuses his brother-in-law of lying or trying to steal the kingdom from him. His brother-in-law says that's ridiculous. Why would he want the kingdom? He's got all the advantages of being part of the royal family and none of the responsibilities. Well, at any rate, it turns out that as the play progresses, we do find out that Oedipus was guilty. And this is a lot of backstory that we get in the play, that we find out that this starts with Oedipus's parents, his birth mother and his birth father, that when Oedipus was born, his parents went to an oracle, which was common at the time. And the oracle told Oedipus's parents that Oedipus would grow up to be a man who would kill his father and marry his mother. The parents are horrified. So what they end up doing is basically giving the baby to a servant with instructions to kill the child. The servant feels sorry for the child and abandons the child on a hilltop. What ends up happening is that child is found by another servant from another kingdom and takes that child to the other kingdom. It just so turns out that the king and queen of that kingdom aren't able to have children. So they're delighted to be presented with this baby, and they raise it as their own and never tell the baby that he's adopted. Now this baby grows up to be a man, Oedipus. And Oedipus goes to see the oracle to find out about his future. And he's given a terrible prophecy that he will one day kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus is horrified and decides that he needs to take action to prevent this. So what he's going to do is to leave home and get as far away physically from his parents as possible so that he can't harm them. Of course, Oedipus does not know that he was adopted. So the people he happens to be leaving are not Oedipus's birth parents, they're his adopted parents. And on Oedipus's travels, it just so turns out that he runs across a man who's blocking the crossroads, and Oedipus, in a fit of anger, as anger is one of Oedipus's flaws, kills the man. And it turns out later that that man is Oedipus's biological father. Oedipus continues on his travels and he finds a community that's ravaged by plague that has just recently lost its king. And the plague is from a monster who's called a sphinx. And the way to solve the problem of the plague is to solve the riddle of the sphinx. And this is an old literary tradition that the way you would defeat monsters is through solving their riddles. And no one is able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx except for Oedipus, because Oedipus is so much smarter than everybody else. And the riddle, by the way, happens to be what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 3 legs. Oh, no, I'm sorry. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? The answer happens to be man. 4 legs in the morning, that would be a baby crawling. Morning would be the beginning of life. 2 legs in the afternoon, that would be adulthood when we walk upright. Afternoon representing adulthood. 3 legs in the evening, evening representing old age, and that would be walking with a cane. Well, Oedipus solves the riddle, and he's given the kingdom as a reward, which also includes the newly widowed queen. And it turns out that newly widowed queen is Oedipus's birth mother, unbeknownst to Oedipus or to the queen. They have children, and obviously this is an affront and a sin, an ancestral sin to the gods, which is the reason why there is plague now again in the community. And this is where Oedipus the king starts as a plague, where Oedipus is a king and trying to figure out what the sin is. The sin is that Oedipus has killed his father and has married his mother and has had children with her. Oedipus's mother/wife, her name is Jocasta. She's so horrified that she commits suicide. And actually, Oedipus, his response is to gouge out his own eyes because his eyes have betrayed him throughout the play. Oedipus has had physical vision but has had no insight. In fact, one of the oracles that Oedipus consults is physically blind. His name is Jocasta, or his name happens to be Tiresias. I'm sorry. He's physically blind, but he has insight. So vision and blindness is a major theme in the play. And then Oedipus ends up saying goodbye to his children. The brother-in-law that Oedipus had accused of treason, Creon, is now ruling the kingdom, ironically. Oedipus says goodbye, and then he wanders off in exile. And it just so turns out that Oedipus is using a cane because he's blind. So in some ways, he has basically fulfilled the prophecy that he was able to solve years earlier because he's walking on 3 legs, even though he's a young man. And the textbook will also give you a summary of the play. And we will watch a performance of the play. And then we will talk about the play. And we will talk about all of the ways that it satisfies Aristotle's criteria for tragedy, as well as talk about some of the ways that it has literary elements that we could examine, not just in this play, but in other pieces that follow afterwards. So, that's what's coming with Oedipus the King. But as you know, I wanted to devote our next class just to paper number 1. So I'm going to talk briefly about paper number 1 next class. Paper number 1 being due approximately October 19th, which is Thursday. And your attendance question for today, which would be due on Thursday the 12th. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And that would give you a sense of what we would talk about in class discussion. What questions, if any, do you have about paper number 1? And if so, what are those questions? So if you don't have any questions, you can just say I have no questions, and that would count to satisfy your attendance. So next class, I'll talk a little bit about paper number 1, but it'll be a short class because I want you to begin working on paper number 1. And then after that, we can begin talking about Oedipus the King. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.